Hello, this is a webinar to review IRS Form 1099s and how we can produce them in PeopleSoft financials. So today what we're going to review are going to be some steps that the council will need to take in order to identify which vendors have been flagged as 1099 withholding vendors, and also whether or not they are properly set up. If we find that there are vendors that need to have some updates to them, we will show you how to edit those vendors so that the withholding information is updated. And after those updates and edits are made, there's some processes that will have to run in PeopleSoft in order to bring those into the system for 1099 reporting. There may be a case when we have to make an adjustment if there was a dollar amount that was entered incorrectly, or there may be some 1099 reporting information that has not been entered into PeopleSoft, and we do want to include that on a particular. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and produce 1099s in PeopleSoft, and also we will be producing the electronic IRS file for those councils who wish to file electronically. So I'm going to start by logging into our beta environment. And here at the screen, I'm going to proceed to the query menu first, because we have established several queries in PeopleSoft that will provide information to help diagnose whether there may be a potential error as far as identifying a vendor withholding or not. In addition to that, there's queries that will help us identify whether or not we've entered tax ID information correctly, whether or not a voucher is flagged for 1099 withholding. So I'll go through a variety of these queries as we proceed. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to our query menu. So I'll go to the main menu, and I'm going to People Reporting Tools, Query, Query Viewer. If I don't have these queries already identified, I can find them by the search menu. I'll type in LC_1099, and then I'll go ahead and click Search. So you'll notice that we have 4 queries that have been identified through this search. And I'm going to take a look at this first query called 1099 vendors. And what this query is going to do is it will produce information on whether or not a vendor has been set up for 1099 withholding in PeopleSoft. Okay. So look at this query. You'll notice that we have the set ID, which is the council business unit. Vendor is the vendor number in PeopleSoft, the name of the vendor, and in the withholding column, you'll see that there's a Y in there, and what that's telling this reader is that these vendors listed here have been flagged for 1099 withholding when the vendor was set up. So if you're looking at this query and you see that there may be a vendor that's missing, or there's a vendor that's on this list that should not be flagged as a 1099 withholding vendor, we'll need to make some adjustments in PeopleSoft. So why don't we start by adding a vendor who we don't see on this particular query. I'll go back to my query viewer. I'm going to open a new window, I'm going to go down to Main Menu, Vendors, Vendor Information, Add Update, Vendor. Go ahead and type in the business unit I'm working in. And if I happen to know a vendor number, I can type it here. Otherwise, I can click Search, and it will give me the long list of vendors for this particular business unit. So I'm going to try this vendor here. And because I'm going in and making adjustments to a vendor, I'd like to check this correct history box before I do my search. And I did not find any information on this vendor. So let me see if I put preceding zeros, if that might help. Okay. Let me go find a vendor. So let's say that maybe this vendor right here, and I'm just going to pick one, Alan William, is supposed to be flagged as a 1099 vendor. And we did not do that when we initially set this vendor up. If I go under the tab Identifying Information, there's a withholding block right here that I will need to check. When I check this block, that's what's going to flag this withholding column on that vendor query that we just looked at. Okay? But after I flag this vendor as withholding for 1099 reporting, I also have to go and make sure that this vendor is set up correctly for 1099 withholding. In order to do that, I'll go to the Locations tab. And under this Detail ribbon, we have a link for 1099 withholding information. Before we click on that, I just want to talk a minute about this effective date. This effective date right here is very important when you're setting up a vendor. If, for instance, you enter a date that is not before an adjustment that you're trying to make to a 1099, the information will not be processed if you're trying to make an adjustment to a period prior to this effective date you're setting this vendor up. So it's important to make sure that we have a date that would precede any adjustments that we might make to a 1099 vendor. So let me just go ahead and show you how we can set up this vendor for 1099 reporting. When I click on the 1099 reporting link, the following menu appears. All I need to do is fill in the information that's left blank here. I'll click on Entity, and I'm going to select the IRS. Type is going to be 1099. Jurisdiction, federal. I'm going to want to check default jurisdiction. And for the default class, we have a menu that pops up where we'll be able to choose which class we want to select. The majority of what we select for ScoutNet users is non-employee compensation, so I'll make that selection here. And then the 1099 status, reporting only. Reporting only is very similar to how 1099s were processed in ScoutNet as well. So next I'll select the entity, IRS, address. This address is the address of the vendor. There's an address tab that pulls this address information in. And whether or not this tax ID number is a federal number or a Social Security number. so I'll use Social Security number for this example. Now when we have to enter the taxpayer identification number, we want to ensure that we enter it with the dashes, and this is how it will appear on the 1099. Okay? And if it was the federal tax identification number that we selected, we want to make sure that we start with the 2 digits, then the dash, then the remaining digits for reporting purposes. Once we enter the taxpayer information, we are finished entering all the data required to set this vendor up as a 1099 vendor. So I'm going to select OK, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save the changes that I made to this vendor. We made a change to this vendor, and the vendor ID was ALL211. If I go back to the query, now I should go ahead and see this vendor appear when I click View Results. And I do. Alan William, ALL211, is now added to this query. So when I look at this query once again, I'm identifying only those vendors that have been set up for 1099 reporting. So what if there's a vendor that's currently on this list that we should remove? Well, why don't we go through an example on how to do that. And I will select this vendor right here, the first one. Remember the vendor number this way. I'll go back to my vendor menu, return to search, replace that vendor ID. Again, correct history is already checked, but if it isn't, make sure you check it. Click search. So we go into the identifying information tab. All I need to do is uncheck the withholding block. Down, and I'll save the vendor information. It's going to give me a warning that there's withholding voucher lines that exist for this particular vendor. And what that means is that this vendor was originally set up for 1099 reporting, and as vouchers were created and paid, they were applicable to 1099 processing. Okay? And we will go over here in another query on how we can make adjustments to the vouchers at the vendor level to make sure that we are including all this information before we produce our 1099s. Go ahead and click OK. I go back to my query menu, run this query again by reviewing results. You'll notice that this vendor has now disappeared. Okay. So the first step is to identify which vendors are set up for 1099 withholding, and if there are any vendors that we set up that are not supposed to be set up as 1099 withholding, we want to remove. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is look at a query that's also going to help you make changes to vendors in the event that maybe tax ID number was entered incorrectly, or you wanted to validate your tax ID numbers to the W-9 we have on file. If we go back to our query viewer, and we have, once again, these 4 queries related to 1099s, there's a query out here that's going to give us information primarily on validating tax identification numbers. And if we go in here and go ahead and run this query, we'll enter the business unit. We'll notice that these vendors that are currently on here may look familiar because they have the withholding flag, very similar to what we saw in the last query. It's again, our business unit, vendor identification, vendor name, Location is just the code that was established when the vendor was set up. The effective date of this vendor, and that refers back to that date I told you about when we set that vendor up. We want to make sure that this effective date is earlier than any adjustments that we're going to make necessary to a 1099 vendor. Type, the S is for Social Security, and the F is for the federal. And if we scan down here and take a look, it's looking pretty good because we have our dashes in there until we get to one vendor. We have this vendor right here, PUT 201 is the vendor number. It's missing the dashes. So in order to make those changes, all I would do is go back to my vendor, type in the vendor ID, okay, and go back to my location tab. I'll select the 1099 link, and I can go ahead and make those changes right here for this particular vendor. Click OK, save. And if I go back to this query and I run it again, you'll notice that the tax ID has now been modified. And that's how you'll make a change to a vendor based off the information that's provided on these queries. So the next step, and if you're referring to the instructions that have been produced on how to enter 1099s in PeopleSoft, this is step number 3. Sorry, step number 2. We're going to go ahead and take a look at a query that is going to help us determine whether or not vouchers align with the vendors that we have created. And the reason that this query is important is because 2012, the conversion year for the councils that converted, there may be some vouchers that were entered in PeopleSoft that may not have been flagged as 1099 reporting vouchers because the vendor may not have been set up correctly. There may be a situation where there's invoices in ScoutNet that were entered that were 1099 applicable. So we're going to have to adjust and make changes to both as we move forward to create 1099s. So this step here, when we run the query vendors underscore vouchers, again, we're bringing to this query all the vendors that have been flagged 1099 withholding. Then we look at the voucher information. Notice that this column here, column is indicating that there are vouchers associated with these vendors that have not been set up to report 1099 purposes. The goal is to have a yes in all of these vouchers associated with a 1099 vendor. So if we have vouchers that have a no next to them, there is a way to make those changes in the system to bring these vendors and vouchers to align for 1099 reporting. So I'm going to take a look at this first vendor right here, and the example that I'm going to use is going to be vendor ALL211. I see that there are more on this query, but I'm only going to make a change to one so you can see what happens. Step 3 on our instructions. Go to the main menu, vendors, 1099 Global Withholding. I'm going to go to the Maintain folder. A lot of what we do to adjust or update vendors and vouchers will be done right here in this folder. So what we're looking to do here is to adjust the withholding information for the vendor. So we'll do that by going to Update Vendor Withholding. First time we do this, we'll have to create a run control. I'm assuming you all know how to do that by now, and I have created a run control already that I'll use for this example. So I'll click on my Update Vendor Withholding, and what I'll need to do here is enter the business unit. Now, if I've been in this menu before and I need to make an additional change, sometimes I can't get to the field that I'm looking to get to, which is down here when I just see my business unit here. So I'll click on the magnifying glass, and you will probably have a link for either local or share. Click on that, and then go back to your business unit. You should notice that now you have blank fields under the Detail Vendor tab for this particular process. First time you set this up, you'll have to define the tax reporting year, and that'll be January 1st through January 31st, 2012. So you may recall that we wanted to make a change to the vendor ALL 211. ALL 211 currently showing as a no, and we want to make that no turn into a yes, because we want to make sure those vouchers for this vendor are included for 1099 reporting. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter ALL 211, that's the vendor number. I'll select the location tab, and this comes from how it was set up on the vendor setup. I will have to enter the business unit. So you may have noticed that there are more than one vendor that we would want to enter in this process to bring all these no's to yeses. I'm going to use one example here today, but you can go ahead and enter multiple by clicking on the plus key, and you may notice that that additional line had made that top line disappear. So if we want to see everything, we can click the View All link, and we can see all the vendors that we add to update this process. Assuming that we've made all those entries, rid of that line so that the process runs, I'll save my changes, and this message will always appear, and it's just a double check, ensuring that the tax year that you have defined is correct. And once again, January through December 2012. I'll click OK to save it. You'll notice that it's saving. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is go to step number 4 on our instructions, and I'm going to update these withholdings. This is a system update. Okay? So we go back to that Maintain menu, and we have an option here to update withholdings. First time we do this, we would have to add a run control. I've already got one in place, so I'm just going to go find the one I previously created. And I'm going to update withholdings. First time you set this up, you do have to put something. I chose to put the number 1 in the request ID. Provide a description. Always process, and process all updates. You have the option to process only vendor updates or voucher line updates. We're not going to talk about voucher line updates during this webinar. So I'll choose all updates. It'll grab every single update available. I'll click Save, and then I'm going to go ahead and run the process. I want to make sure my server name is PSNT and that there's a check mark in the withholding update process before I run it. My process monitor is showing that this process is queued. Once this is complete, we will go back to that query and see if those N's have changed to a Y for those vouchers. So the process has run successfully and it's posted. Now I'm going to go back to that query, vendor underscore vouchers, and I'm going to run it again, and the goal is to have these N's turn to Y. I just want to point out that there may be sometimes that all these vouchers that are flagged here do not all have a Y when you run the query. So if you run the process on all your vendors and you're still getting a Y on one or two of those vendors, the reason for that would be because you may have, in this particular circumstance, entered information in 2013, and this query does not select from a date range. It just grabs real-time data. So you may have no's on all but one or two of your vouchers, and that may be because you have entered something in the current year that you're working on, and that's okay. Just be mindful that they may not always turn to Y after you get done running your process. So at this point, we've made changes to our vendors. We've made adjustments to any vendor information that we were aware of. We double-checked our tax ID numbers. We went ahead and we looked at the vouchers that are associated with each one of our 1099 vendors. So the next step would be to take a look at what information PeopleSoft is going to look at in order to produce 1099s. We're going to go back to our query menu. And this query right here, it's LC underscore 1099 withhold information. Run this query. There are a lot of data fields, by the way, that may not be meaningful to you at this point, so just ignore them. But there's also some key columns that I want you to focus on. So all the information that's currently on this query is going to be brought into the process to produce 1099s for this business unit. Notice that we'll see the vendor number, IRS 1099, business unit. This is some banking information if this vendor was paid. If there was an adjustment made, that will show as well. We haven't talked about adjustments yet. Dates, the date they were posted, the basis, this is the amount driving those totals. And a description associated with each voucher level entry. And you notice that working in here prior, there have been some adjustments made, and there are some descriptions on why those adjustments were made. Okay? So this is a query you may want to reference back to before you actually produce your 1099s. So assuming everything looks to be in order, our next step is going to be to generate 1099s. And that's going to be step number 6 in the instructions to process 1099s in PeopleSoft. So we're going to go to our main menu, Vendors, 1099 Global Withholding, and we're going to go to 1099 Reports. We're going to run this process called Withhold 1099 Report Job. First time we run this, once again, we have to create a run control. I've already created one. So the information has already been populated because I've already created this. First time you create it, I do want to point out there's some things that you do not want to overlook. So pay particular attention to the instructions that have been sent, because the look on a few of these fields in the beta environment, which I'm working in now, are a little different in production, where you'll be working when you produce these. Let's start at the beginning here under the 1099 Report Post ribbon. In our request ID, I entered 1099. You can enter anything you like. I put a description in there. Process frequencies always. It's important to check include manual overrides. If you don't include manual overrides, if you make any adjustments, when you go to run your 1099 processes, they will not be included. So make sure this is checked. Our control set ID will be the business unit that you're working in. Control ID, this one is set for test. In production, I believe there's one out there, number 1, and it'll probably say Boy Scouts of America, or it may have your council name on it. I'm not sure exactly what your environment's going to look like, but it won't say test. Calendar will be share, and it's easy the first time you set this up to just type in the word share. Calendar ID, click on the drop-down box. You want to look for something that will describe the year that you're producing 1099, so it may say something like 2012 1099 calendar. You want to type in the fiscal year that you're working in. You'll also want to make sure you have a check mark and use report date for vendor. Lastly, period. Period 1. That may be confusing to some, but we've set a calendar up to capture all 12 months, and we called it period 1. Okay? So there isn't a period 12 out there. Please do not get confused. So after we've entered all that information, we're going to go down to the 1099 Report ribbon and take a look at our options under the Type and File Return drop-down. Mine is set for test. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to generate a test electronic filing file that can be sent to the IRS to validate your 1099 files before you actually finalize them using original or correction process. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and process this to test. If you don't file electronically, you don't have to go back in, run this process again, and change it to original or correction, unless you have to go back in and make changes. Okay? So if you're just going to go ahead and print the 1099s, manually create a 1096, send it into the IRS, you don't have to go back and run this process again if there are no problems with the 1099s that you generate at this time. Okay? So I'm going to select test, and then I want to make sure that the withhold type is all. If you click on this, it's just grabbing all the 1099s. Depending on the size of your council, you may want to add some additional selections here. You can run it on all your vendors or on a specific vendor or vendors. You'll notice that a box appeared down here when I chose that. And this may be in the case if you have to make a correction or an adjustment and you don't want to have to print all those 1099s again. You can just select the one you want to print. Back and select all. And these will print in an order that you select. And you have three options on how you want to print your 1099s. You can print them by name, by tax identification number, or by the vendor ID number. I'm going to select vendor ID number for this test here. Once I've entered all that information, and once again, please refer to the instructions on the details to make sure you have all those blocks filled out correctly. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And I'll need to run this process. So you'll notice that we're at the screen where we can actually select what processes we want to run. You can run these processes individually if you wanted to. However, you have to run some of these in a certain order, and we felt it'd be a little confusing at this point to put that burden on you when we have a way of just running all these processes by selecting one process called 1099 job, and that'll go ahead and run all these processes and launch the process. Before we do, let's make sure that our server name is PSNT. Click OK. We've just launched the process to generate 1099s. I will say that because we selected that 1099 job, it can take about 5 minutes for all of these processes to complete. So at this point, most councils only need 2 files out of all these processes that are going to be generated. And those files are going to be the 1099 report file and the 1099 miscellaneous copy B file. So if we go and we take a look at our report manager, what processes are still running and which ones are pending, I like to go ahead and click on the Administration tab. And that's showing me all the processes that were a part of that job. And you'll notice that some of them have already run and they have already posted. Those councils that choose to file electronically with the IRS, they'll want to come to this link right here where it says 1099 report. When you click on that, this is the actual text file that will be sent to the IRS. So you may recall we ran this to a test, and I believe that this T up here in the upper left-hand corner before the date will tell the IRS that this file is for test purposes only. But they'll validate the other information and confirm whether or not this file is acceptable. When you get that confirmation back, you'll want to go back and run this process to the original/correction and then send that file to the IRS upon completion. The instructions on how to do that at the very end of the document, how you can save this to a text file on either your desktop or a directory on your server for future use when you file with the IRS. Those councils who choose not to file electronically, back and let me find out where I left off here. Let me refresh the screen. We're going to go to the 1099 miscellaneous copy B. So you'll notice that these are the 1099s that have been created based on all the processes that we've just gone through. I want to point out that it's important for you to print out the 1099s and to review the payer's information. That's the council information. If you find that there's a discrepancy with a spelling error or there's address that needs to be corrected, or payer's federal identification number is incorrect or doesn't have the dash, we're working in beta, so this one is a bunch of test data, it does not have the dash. You need to contact the help desk because this is a configuration change that will need to be made here at the national office. This information was based off of the setup spreadsheets that were sent in. However, if there's a change that needs to be made at the vendor level, and that's going to be the recipient's identification number or name and address, this change will be made at the vendor level, and you'll be responsible for making those changes. Dollar amounts that need to be changed. I'm going to show you how to make some adjustments here in a minute just to show you how we can modify or correct a 1099 if there needs to be a correction made. So these files can be printed. They can be printed and sent right to the IRS with a 1096 for filing if they are accurate and meet your satisfaction, or they can be filed electronically with that electronic file that I referenced earlier. I recommend that you either save your 1099 files and store them, or make sure you print an extra copy for your filing purposes. Okay, so we've just gone through the process of producing 1099s in PeopleSoft. So there's one other area I do want to touch before we conclude, and that is how adjustments are made to 1099s in PeopleSoft. And there's a separate set of instructions that will be available on the website, Finance Impact Department website, that will walk you through how to make an adjustment to the 1099. So I'll do a quick example here. I'm going to go ahead and close some of these queries I was working on. I'm going to go back to my query manager. And I'm going to find those queries. Vendor to adjust. Well, why don't I just take this first vendor, Alan William. Let's say that there was a balance for several invoices that were in ScoutNet that, due to conversion in 2012, were not reflected in PeopleSoft. And this may be the case for several vendors. You'll have to go into ScoutNet and identify which 1099 vendors had amounts that you want to bring into PeopleSoft to include in their 1099 totals. So I can go in and make an adjustment to this vendor. I'll go into my menu here, vendors, 99 withholding, back to that maintain file, and you'll notice that we have a menu for adjust withholdings. I'm going to find Alan. There's only 2 items I need to enter in order to get some information on these vendors, and that's going to be the business unit and the entity. I'm going to click the search block, and you'll notice that this is the information that appears. We have 2 lines of data that we can see. I want to point out that there's actually 8 lines of data. In order to see them, we'll click View All. Okay. Click on the transaction information. These are the dollar amounts associated with this vendor. Payment information. The reason that we do have payment information on this tab is because these were checks generated through PeopleSoft accounts payable. And then if there's an adjustment reason, the system will default to withholding update. Okay. So we identified that there was some ScoutNet, or there was a reason to make an adjustment to this particular vendor. I can make an adjustment just by clicking the plus key, and then we have this next line that will show up, and it says Legacy. This was actually designed for the ScoutNet totals to come forward. You may have a ranger that you have to report some type of housing value, and maybe you missed it on the W-2 or whatever the reason. Go ahead and enter the data that's required here. You can get the same data by clicking on the drop-down magnifying glasses or type it in. Under class, I just want to show you that the class is only going to give you the option that you originally set this vendor up as. Okay? We'll select Rule 0. We're going to enter the information at the main tab, and this is the change that we're making. We'll go to the Transaction tab. This is where we enter that dollar amount that we want to adjust it to. Adjust. If I added $1,000 here, it's going to add an additional $1,000 to what PeopleSoft already recognizes for 1099 reporting. I want to make sure that the payment date is after the date the vendor was set up. And I know I touched on that twice already, but it's important that the payment date is after the date the vendor was set up. So I recommend using the last day of the year. That way you won't run into any challenges if you set up a vendor incorrectly. Once I went ahead and added my basis amount, I can put a payment amount if I want. Really does not have an impact on the 1099 dollar amount that's produced. I don't have to put anything in payment information. If I click on here, you'll notice that I don't have that ability anyway, because this is all reference information for vouchers processed in PeopleSoft. But I do want to click on the adjust reason. Here I can enter something like balance, whatever your reason for the adjustment may be. Okay, it looks like I've entered everything I need to. I'm going to click Save. So I've went ahead and made an adjustment to a vendor from an outside source, if you will. And the next thing I'm going to want to do then is refer back to my instructions on how to process 1099s, and I'm going to refer back to step number 4. Step number 4 is going to ask that we do is click on the Maintain menu. We need to update the withholding information. Once we make our adjustments, and I'll save it again just to make sure, I'm going to update withholding information. Once again, I've already got a run control for this. Run the process. When this is done running, I'll go ahead and pull that query and see if this transaction has now made its way to that query. Then we can go ahead and proceed to generate 1099s, and that will pick up this new dollar amount for this vendor in the total for the 1099. Okay. Ran the withholdings. I'm going to take a look at the 1099 withhold information query. I believe it's going to be this right here because we don't have any bank information and we did change ALL to 11,000. These are our effective dates. Notice that description I typed in, balance from ScoutNet, that shows here, and it shows the date that I made this transaction. So all I would need to do next is go back to 1099 reports. $1099 report job, run my 1099 job, and this will go ahead and generate 1099s again, and any changes or adjustments that were made will be picked up in this process. Okay, well that concludes this 1099 webinar. If you have any questions or if you need any additional assistance, please contact the National Service Desk. On the FID website, we have the instructions for processing 1099s and adjusting 1099s in PeopleSoft for your review. Thank you for your time. Good luck.